Tensions in the Caribbean, U.S. strikes on alleged Venezuelan drug vessels and the imperative for scrutiny. In a series of military operations commencing in early September 2025, the United States has executed lethal strikes against vessels in the Caribbean Sea suspected of originating from Venezuela and engaging in drug trafficking. On October 5, 2025, President Donald Trump announced, during a public statement, that U.S. forces had conducted another strike on a boat allegedly carrying illegal drugs off Venezuela's coast the previous evening, marking at least the fifth such action since the campaign's inception. These operations, justified by the Trump administration as essential countermeasures against narco-terrorists, have resulted in over 25 deaths, predominantly individuals aboard the targeted boats. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has repeatedly described the strikes as targeted disruptions to narcotics flows, yet they have elicited strong international backlash, including Russia's declaration of full support for Venezuela and condemnation of the actions as provocative. This essay examines these events grounded in documented facts from official announcements, media reports, and analytical assessments. It offers a deep analysis of the strategic objectives, operational methods, and wider ramifications, while providing fact-based critiques on the absence of verifiable evidence for drug claims, the imprudence of militarized tactics, and biases in media coverage. Additionally, it incorporates recommendations for alternative approaches, emphasizing U.S. restraint from interfering in other nations' affairs. By relying on verifiable sources, the discussion underscores how these strikes, while yielding short-term tactical gains, may intensify regional instability and erode U.S. international standing. Historical and geopolitical context. U.S. engagement in Caribbean counter-narcotics efforts dates to long-standing initiatives, such as the 2012 Operation Martillo, which emphasized maritime interdictions to curb drug shipments from South America. Venezuela, under President Nicolás Maduro, has faced U.S. accusations of aiding narcotrafficking, with reports suggesting a substantial share of Colombian cocaine passes through its territory. U.S. sanctions, since 2017, have exacerbated Venezuela's economic woes, contributing to poverty rates surpassing 90% and possibly incentivizing illicit activities among coastal populations. The 2025 strikes extend from a 2020 naval deployment under Trump's first administration, which bolstered regional counter-narcotics operations amid claims of Maduro regime involvement in the drug trade. Geopolitically, these actions unfold amid strained U.S.-Venezuela relations, with Venezuela forging close ties to Russia and China. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov's recent affirmations highlight Moscow's support, portraying the strikes as escalatory and potentially destabilizing. This backdrop elevates routine interdictions into a potential arena for great power rivalry. Timeline of the recent operations. The operations began on September 2, 2025, with a U.S. strike that killed 11 people on a vessel in the southern Caribbean, which Trump claimed was transporting drugs. A second strike on September 15 involved U.S. military assets targeting another boat, resulting in 6 deaths. Additional strikes later in September added to the fatalities. On October 3, Hegseth announced a fourth strike near Venezuela's coast, killing 4 men on a boat labeled a narco-trafficking vessel. The latest action, confirmed by Trump on October 5, involved destroying a 5th suspected drug vessel, with limited details on casualties. These strikes signify a departure from conventional U.S. Coast Guard practices of boarding and seizing vessels, opting instead for aggressive military actions in international waters using naval destroyers and aircraft. This contrasts with protocols under the 1981 Caribbean Maritime Counter-Narcotics Agreement, which favored non-lethal interventions. Strategic analysis, imprudent tactics and escalatory risks. The strikes employ high-value military assets, such as missile launches from naval ships, against inexpensive targets like small go-fast boats. Critiques highlight this as inefficient, comparing it to using disproportionate resources for minimal gains, potentially diverting assets from other global priorities. The approach is imprudent due to the risk of misidentification, as boats are obliterated without prior inspection, in a region where economic distress blurs distinctions between fishing and smuggling. Escalation risks are evident. U.S. naval positioning near Venezuelan waters has prompted incidents like Venezuelan aircraft overflights of U.S. ships. Trump's vows of land crackdowns raise concerns of expanded intervention, reminiscent of past U.S. actions in Latin America. Analyses suggest these tactics offer only fleeting disruptions, as traffickers reroute, failing to tackle underlying issues like U.S. drug demand and Venezuelan institutional corruption. Evidential shortcomings, lack of proof for drug allegations. A significant factual deficiency is the lack of physical evidence substantiating drug claims. In each instance, vessels were sunk or destroyed, precluding recovery of alleged narcotics. U.S. assertions depend on intelligence, such as satellite imagery, but no contraband has been publicly exhibited. This opacity questions the operation's validity, with reports noting that without proof, the strikes appear as unverified actions rather than legitimate interdictions. Venezuelan denials and international scrutiny emphasize the unverifiable U.S. claims absent wreckage analysis. Media coverage, insufficiency and bias. Reporting on these events varies, often prioritizing U.S. official narratives without rigorous verification. U.S. outlets like CNN and ABC News have prominently featured Hegseth's and Trump's statements, stressing the narco-trafficking angle and Pentagon-provided casualty data. However, the coverage lacks depth in examining evidential gaps or humanitarian effects, with minimal fieldwork from the region. Bias appears in pro-administration portrayals of precision justice, while international sources like Al Jazeera, BBC, and Reuters incorporate Venezuelan and Russian viewpoints, questioning legality and risks. Social media amplifies divisions, with algorithmic preferences potentially favoring US-centric sensationalism. Critiques, legal, humanitarian, and ideological dimensions. Legally, the strikes leverage the 2001 authorization for use of military force, classifying suspected traffickers as combatants, but experts challenge this under international law, contending drug smuggling does not equate to armed conflict warranting lethal force and due process. Humanitarian issues are stark. Fatalities, including possibly coerced individuals from destitute communities, have been termed summary executions by advocacy groups, worsening Venezuela's migration crisis. Ideologically, the policy faces criticism for hypocrisy, as U.S. sanctions fuel the economic desperation enabling trafficking, while domestic efforts inadequately address demand. An enigmatic question arises amid these critiques: if the United States could precisely determine the number of people killed on the boats in these attacks, why couldn't they specify the quantity of drugs allegedly on board? Furthermore, why does the United States not conduct similar lethal strikes against Mexican cartels, which are far more directly involved in trafficking drugs into the U.S.? Or is it because the underlying motive is to dominate Venezuela's vast petroleum reserves and other natural wealth, using counter-narcotics as a pretext for geopolitical control? Recommendations, emphasizing restraint and alternatives. To address these challenges, the U.S. should prioritize restraint from unilateral interference in other countries' affairs, respecting sovereignty and international norms to avoid escalatory cycles. Specifically, enhance diplomatic engagement, revive multilateral forums like the Organization of American States, OAS, for collaborative counter-narcotics strategies, involving Venezuela and allies like Colombia, rather than kinetic actions that risk sovereignty violations. Focus on non-military approaches, invest in economic development aid for Venezuelan coastal communities to reduce poverty-driven smuggling, and strengthen intelligence sharing with regional partners for targeted, non-lethal interdictions. Address domestic demand, implement comprehensive U.S. drug policy reforms, such as expanded treatment programs and decriminalization models inspired by Portugal, which reduced usage by 50%, to curb the root demand fueling trafficking. Promote transparency and accountability, require public disclosure of evidence pre- and post-strikes, and subject operations to independent oversight to build trust and prevent misuse of military force. These recommendations advocate for restraint, emphasizing diplomacy over intervention to foster long-term stability. Conclusion: toward fact-based alternatives. Drawing from documented evidence, the U.S. strikes on alleged Venezuelan vessels expose a policy burdened by evidential flaws, tactical imprudence, and media biases, potentially sparking unnecessary escalation. By adopting recommendations centered on restraint and multilateralism, the U.S. can mitigate risks, transforming tactical measures into sustainable strategies that enhance hemispheric security without compromising principles.